Hello and welcome to WriteHive's panel on world building. This panel will have several parts. We will first ease into world building with the panelists going into some basics and telling us about their process before we go into some more effective world building tips and questions. I am your moderator, Isabel Suarez, and I am joined by 4 panelists. Our first panelist is Erin, who is amassing an army of fluffy minions to take over the world. Currently at 42 and counting, but progress has stalled because she hasn't figured out soul transmutation. In the meantime, she entertains a mild tea obsession and writes epic fantasy. It's her goal to introduce readers to the complexities of mental illness through the perspectives of lifelike characters in fantasy worlds. Our second panelist is KJ Harwick, who is a freelance developer and graphic designer, the creator of Winter Views, and the co-creator of Writer in Notion and the Rewrite It Club. With a passion for secondary fantasy worlds, like those found in the books of Andre Norton, Ivan Katt, and Rand and Robin Miller, she now writes her own bizarre fantasy and science fiction stories, usually laced with sex and dragons. Currently, she resides in the rainy Pacific Northwest, where she works on a broad range of client projects, plots how to destroy her characters' lives, and occasionally falls down rabbit holes. Our third panelist is Maria, who is, at heart, a temperamental thrill seeker. An always writer and a sometimes performer, she spends most of her days buried in words and off-roading with her ambition. P.S. She loves dragons. Finally, our fourth panelist is Sil, who began writing because she wanted to tell the story of Nurini and the main characters. On the journey, she has spent time writing and conlanging while watching YouTube videos on topics of world building. Nowadays, she is in various writing servers, honing the craft of writing. Otherwise, she is studying mechanical engineering, working towards her bachelor's degree. Let's get started with a very basic question. Why is world building important? KJ, we'll start with you.
World building is important because worlds not only impact the characters who inhabit them, but they're also shaped by flora, fauna, sentience, cultural habits, technology, politics. There's a lot of elements. It's sort of like a human body has hundreds of pieces, and worlds react the same way. So when you're world building, you have to bring all of those little pieces into the character's life and show how they impact the character and how the character influences in return.
Thank you. Erin?
World building is important because it can and should inform the stories you tell. Plots can develop because of how your world and its history are shaped, and the world can form from the obstacles your characters need to face as well. The world determines the ideologies your characters believe in and how they were raised, the toolkits they have to overcome the challenges your story creates for them. And an example I like to say, or like to use every now and then, is if your characters are from an underground community that believes the eyes and the walls are their gods, they'll have different beliefs and goals and challenges to overcome than someone who comes from a floating island that can talk to the wind. So if you don't spend enough time world building, then your characters and plot might start to feel flat.
Thank you for that answer. Sil?
I believe like the world building, it makes the world more believable and can often make it more consistent. Like, for example, people who can make fire through their hands maybe have a little less need for stoves in their kitchen. Like you can also pull off things that aren't realistic to this world if you have world built rules consistent. So riding dragons is like, and of course you can ride dragons in that world, though you can't ride dragons here. So yeah, that makes the reader accept the impossible. It also makes the world three-dimensional, and you can make the reader fall in love with the world because it becomes alive in many ways. Yeah.
Thank you. Maria?
Okay, so I firmly believe that the immersive aspect of the escapism that fantasy, and to a broad extent fiction, is known for and is sought for is always going to be made more whole by solid and meaningful world building. I think people read fiction to bring themselves somewhere and anywhere that is not here, especially when they're in difficult circumstances or circumstances that they would rather not be in, especially in times like, well, now when we're recording this particular panel, because everybody's stuck in quarantine, likely everybody wants to be somewhere else that isn't just stuck at home. So stories best help them do that when they're in a world that is crafted with love and care and shows just how much work and thought was put into them. So as writers, our job is not just to dream up the stories, but to draw people into them. And a large part of that involves making the world compelling, and that is why world building is so important.
Thank you. World building overall is a very daunting task with many different elements that goes into it. What do you think is the most challenging aspect of world building, and how does one deal with it? KJ?
One of the toughest parts I've always found is, what do you include in the story and what do you hold back just as the mechanics of the world? I've read stories where, authors will take chapters and chapters and chapters to really set up this idea of how their world functions, but then they forget the characters, that they're actually there and they're existing and they're moving around in this world. And I've seen others that write these characters that are beautiful and have a lot of emotion and reaction, but then you don't really know where they are. They're just kind of in this white space that you can't quite connect in your head. So one of the most challenging things is to take both of those elements and understand that symbiotic relationship, that one can't exist without the other. And they really constantly influence each other and react to each other. And it's hard to know where to find that really magnificent balance.
Erin?
I've found that the most challenging aspect of world building for me is staying focused. I really like to work on large, expansive worlds. My current project has like 10 continents. And so while planning that world, I get distracted from the stories that I'm actually trying to tell about my characters, and sometimes get lost in plotting the overarching themes and characteristics of the world, which aren't necessarily relevant to the actual story I'm trying to tell right now. So I try to deal with that by acknowledging the ideas that I have for that greater world, but I tell myself that it's okay to think super long term, but that I need to accept my limitations, that I can't work on it all right now if I want to actually publish and write stuff that people are going to read.
So?
My biggest challenge, I think, is a bit of like how much is too much world building, like how much is too much time spent on it, and how much is like too little, and you find that you run into a corner when you write, and like, I actually don't know the answer to that. No, I need to world build before I can continue writing. And then you have the others of like world building a complete culture that you likely won't visit in any of your books. So I need to find out where between the two I need to settle.
Maria?
I think that in any instance, the most challenging aspect of world building really is disallowing the world and its development from overpowering either the story or the characters or both. Because the plot and the characters and the world are all very much important, but if any of them should shine in a story, I firmly believe at best it should be the character, because right now, when looking at the arena, when looking at the fiction writing scene, when looking at the industry, what is driven right now and what people tend to go for are character-driven stories. And while that may change in the future, I still do believe that the world should be there to underline both the plot and the character. And the plot and the characters, conversely, should also be able to showcase different aspects of the world. But if one should be overpowering to the other, it should always be the character first. So the difficult part of world building is that when you have poured that much love and meaning and thought into creating that world, you kind of want it to be very, very important, and you kind of want it to be, you know, a little bit of a star. So the challenge is tempering how passionate you are about that and allowing the world that you have built to work harmoniously with the goals that you have in mind for your plot and your characters and your story overall. And that can be difficult because you really might want to sink into that, but it's not impossible with discipline, with revisions, with a lot of things. So there.
So several of you have kind of mentioned in passing your process of how you world build. And I think it's very valuable to give people an example of this. So what is your world building process? KJ?
You know, my process used to be just focusing on the world. I would sit for hours or days or weeks, and I would, you know, figure out what's all the nuances of the magic system. What are the different cultures? How does this universe operate as a whole versus on sort of like a world level and a national level? And then I would just throw the characters in and just kind of go, well, what's going to happen now? But as I've grown as a writer and understood that, you know, that world and character are sort of an ecological system that go together, it's just become a mess. You know, there are days where I can envision a character and I sort of start moving a little bit and seeing what they can do, what they're telling me, you know, and sort of exploring the world that way. What is their world? What's it like? And I try to do it with no boundaries. If their entire world is inside a bubble that's in an infinite sea, perfect. You know, I let them tell me what they're doing. But there are other days where I'm trying to understand the motivations of the characters and all these influences that have impacted them. So I will go back to, you know, just building all the elements and trying to understand, okay, what's around them? What do I see that the reader doesn't necessarily need to see? I just need to see the gears. So my process is basically just whatever's happening in my story, whatever's happening in my world, I just jump to find the answers to the thing and start asking why.
Thank you. Erin, what is your process?
I think my process is pretty similar to KJ's, where I'll let the characters speak for what the world building needs to be. So I don't usually start by digging into all the details of the world and figuring out all the relationships between the different countries and the cultures and all that stuff. I'll just start with the general idea or a character or a scenario, and then I'll start writing. And I'll discover the world building as I need it. And there's always a point where I realize with the characters writing the story that I need to step back and write more or of the actual world to fill it in more. But until that point, usually it's just a feedback process. Sorry. It's a feedback process between me and my characters.
Okay.
Love your cat.
Yeah,
All right,
she's
the cat
been very
has gone
social
back,
today.
laying down. Still?
Is it me now?
Yes, so.
Okay. Well, it varies a little bit for me too, but I like to have the map very like early on, so that it's to me very much easier to world build if I have a map. And then I do like basics, like make out like what climate it is it rainy and such. And like I begin with the base, and then I like go between world building and planning and writing, or writing, and like go a bit back and forth after I made a base of like basic culture, map, and climate. My process for Nirini was a little bit different, but that was because that was my first project. So yeah.
Maria?
Well, this might surprise some people who know me as a very structured and by the book kind of plotter or planner, but I'm fairly fluid with world building. So I start always with thinking of what kind of world I want to create. And normally I focus first on just one aspect that really excites me, aside from obviously how many dragons there are going to be in the world, because that's like a given when it comes to me. So aside from the dragons, or after the dragons, I focus on one aspect of the world. This is normally the magic system. Sometimes it's the ecology, sometimes it's culture, sometimes it's what kind of deities there are, but usually it's the magic system. So I build around that aspect thoroughly, and then I take a step back. So I draft out the basics to get the general vibe of the world, and I build a little bit of everything. So there's geography, history, biology, technology, anthropology, and of course the politics of it all, because I like when I draw out the history and I map out the culture, I think politics is very important in there, and it always plays a great deal in any world that I put together. And then I take another step back and I leave it all alone to let it steep for a little while. And after this, while it's steeping, I begin writing my outlines and building on the basics of the world. And when I hit a point in the outlines where I need a break, I take that break by world building intensively. So when I need a break from world building, conversely, I return to the story, and then I keep going at the outlines, or when I'm done with the outlines, I'll start with the actual story words, and then I just rinse and repeat. So basically, I'm making sure that at any point, I'm always using creative energy in some way, be it writing or building the world, and allowing both to sort of inform the other. So that is my world building process in a nutshell.
Okay. So we've talked about the challenging parts of world building. How about your favorite parts? KJ?
Everything. Honestly, world building is just, it's something that's just so amazing to do, My favorite parts when I'm actually building is just really getting into the nitty gritty of the flora, honestly, and fauna. I love looking at the animals. I love looking at the plants and seeing how I can really sort of twist and subvert some of them. I love the idea of carnivorous trees, or shifters that shift into really unusual things. But really, and then when I'm reading, I want to step inside somebody else's world that they created, and I want to feel like I've completely left this planet. I want to feel like I'm in such an entirely different setting that anything is possible. And then I want to explore their setting, and it's just, there's something really magical about stepping into another world and getting to explore it on your own and meet these characters that really inhabit it and influence it.
Thank you. Erin?
For me, my favorite part is definitely the research. There's nothing more satisfying than learning about a variety of different cultures and histories and finding the pieces that are perfect for the stories or circumstances I'm trying to build, or finding something new and having an idea of how I can use it to inform my work. Recently, I spent like 6 hours researching a calendar system, which is a little overboard. But I also have spent a lot of time researching mythological and folkloric creatures to use, and languages. I love languages. I haven't tried making my own yet, but I spent more hours researching pronunciation systems and stuff that I can reasonably count.
I support.
6 hours traumatizes me. Just the thought of it. Phil, what are your favorite parts of world building?
Well, I like many different parts of world building, including cultures and such, but there's a favorite, and that is conlanging. And that is to make your own language, and it can easily be a rabbit hole, so it's something to be careful about, to not dive too deep into. But I think it can conlanging can be a good immersion if your character meets foreign characters, and not everybody has English as a native language. Like that foreign character greets you in a special way, or has a special expression that even a bonus can't be translated well into English, and even more bonus if that reader like gets a sense of it, or like. But I think it's for the uh, um, for the like getting into the world, and in addition, I think conlang will for that culture will fit that culture perfectly, so you don't get a weird mix with like English being like language that is a little bit adapted to the sea, for example, but your culture is in the middle of a desert. So yeah, so but conlang I think is my favorite.
So Erin can ask Sil later on when she's ready to make languages.
Yay!
What
I
about
think
you, Maria? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think the power of languages in fantasy is underlooked.
Absolutely.
That's true.
That's true. Maria?
Well, aside from figuring out how to put dragons in everything, I love building cultures. So determining why people act the way they act and infusing community-wide idiosyncrasies and rituals into everyday life, or detailing the little parts that make society function, or researching like world history from our world and using parts of that to help inform the politics of the world that I'm building. Those are all such rich aspects of world building and such ripe opportunities to show the reader an entirely new perspective on things. So I really love building that, because I think building culture is one of the most one of the things that can be overlooked, because it's not really as simple as just, oh, this is what they do in the morning and then this is what they do at night, and they like doctors and all that stuff. That stuff is nice to have, but building one that is cohesive and comprehensive and makes sense when you really peer into it, I love that. So culture, it's great.
I'm supposed to transition out of culture. It's great.
Yes. You're welcome.
But yes, culture is great. And it does provide for a more felt in world.
Mhm.
So, okay. Easy questions are done. those were the easy questions. Let's dive a little deeper with some effective world building. I know that most of you probably get asked this question a lot. How do you world build? But that's a little bit too broad, so let's narrow it down to what are 3 general building blocks that you always start with when world building? KJ?
I look at the universe as a whole. I know a lot of people start real small, or they start with just a world, a planet, an area. I actually look at the universe. What kind of universe is this? Does it have dragons? Does it have space and technology? Are we using a planet system? Are we using a flat earth system? I like to kind of get a feel for what's new and exotic that I can bring to this universe and make it impact hundreds of worlds. And then I sort of go, the next step is an energy flow. Every universe has an energy flow through it, and multiple energies. So, you know, I look at energy as starship fuel or magic, and how does that affect all of these different worlds? How is that energy used to manipulate it? Does it already exist? Does it already, you know, does it need to be created? How does this work? And then I start to look at more of the character, and this is where the world really starts to take shape, is what is unique about these characters? What sets them apart from each other? What sets them apart from their families, from, you know, animals or trees? And what is it about that makes them stand out as they are such a unique character that a story has to be told around them? And so once I sort of have those 3 building blocks sort of starting to form in my head, that's when I can really look at the character and say, okay, let's do some movement. Let's see what happens. And then for a bonus block, I start asking why. You know, Lisa Cron has a fantastic book called Story Genius. And you know, her big method is just keep asking why until you absolutely have an answer to everything. So if you keep asking why and keep digging, you will find those deep roots that really help flourish and make a story come alive and its world.
I can second. Story Genius is really, really great.
Oh yes, fantastic book.
Erin, what are your 3 general building blocks?
I can't actually say that I really have 3, because for me, each aspect of world building its importance depends on the story I'm trying to tell. But I can narrow it down to 2 that I'll probably always start with. That's going to be the main culture of the characters that my story focuses around, because that'll determine how they behave and what they believe in. And my second one will have to be magic, because my stories are always filled with magic. But for culture, that's my main important one, because the culture is going to look different in every story you tell, unless I guess you're telling multiple stories in one place. But if we go back to that example I had before about the sky people and the cave people, their world building needs are going to be way different. So for my 3rd and 4th blocks, I might need a more developed magic system or monster system than the other ones for the cave people than the sky people. And one might have a more complex government or political system. So I take my 2 and then the needs of the others. Then the needs of the culture depend on what the 3rd and other important aspects are going to be.
Sil?
I think I think maybe I have 3 categories. To be honest, I found this question a little bit hard to understand, really. But yeah, I would maybe categorize my blocks at like the world, like what kind of map is it? What kind of climate is it? Is it a forest there? Is there a city here? Is it a railway there? The culture, like what's the politics? What's the context like there? What's the culture like there? And when do people get up from bed? And how do they eat? And third are like rules in this world, like can people shoot lasers out of their feet? Can people like suddenly just self-combust? Does negative energy exist, so faster than light travel is easy? Rules.
Thank you. And Maria?
Okay, so this was having only 3 general building blocks is tearing me apart a little bit because I have so many, but I decided to condense them. So one of the first things that I determine is what are the power dynamics like in this world. So that could be on a global scale, and you go down to the national scale, to the household scale, to the interpersonal scale, because again, politics is everything and everything is politics. So power dynamics for me is incredibly important to ascertain, because I need to know, for example, whether or not a particular character or a particular type of character is going to be wielding much power in any one way or another in this world, and what it's going to look like when people are interacting on a conversational level, or when people are interacting at the level of institutions and at the level of, you know, intercontinental politics. And all of those things matter to me and to the stories that I want to tell. So power dynamics is something that I build on very much. That's the first thing. The second thing that I build on is asking, what is the level of their technological advancement and how does magic play a part? So I think the 4 of us basically concur that magic matters. So for me, building the magic system is one of the first few things I do, and it's also one of the most important ones and one of my favorite parts, because determining how exactly magic matters in this current world that I'm building and how it affects the people, how people affect it, how it interacts with the world, that matters to me. And tied to that is the level of this world's technological advancement, because I am a firm and true believer in consistency, in world building and in story writing and in character development. What does this mean? This means that if I've decided, for example, that my world, such as the one that I'm writing now, which is gaslamp fantasy, and that therefore means it's either Edwardian or Victorian England in nature. I chose Victorian. If that's what I've decided, that's what I'm going to stick to, because while obviously the very nature of fiction, and by extent fantasy, is the suspension of disbelief, obviously you don't want to stretch that suspension too far, because you can go too far and it will be difficult for the reader to follow, or it will be difficult for you as the writer to maintain that balance between, yeah, I think that this fantasy world is cool, and I really don't think this is plausible at all. So determining their level of technological advancement, determining what the language was like in that era, determining how people referred to things, determining, even to a smaller extent, the sensibilities of people, the way people thought about many issues or any issues really, that consistency is extremely important to me. So that's the second thing that I determine. And the third thing, probably one of the most important things, is asking, how can I use the world to draw out the story? Because of course, the world for me has to help serve the story. So I need to be able to know how I can use this particular world and how I can build it so I can use it to separate the main character and what they want most. Because of course, if the main character already had what they wanted most, and they were happy at the start, and they didn't, need to step out of their comfort zone, we wouldn't have a story. So my job, or the way I view my job, is building a world that will separate the main character and what they want, or a world that very much provides meaning to the character's journey between where they are and where they want to be. So the kind of world I want to build is one that is meaningful to both character and reader. That's why that is the third thing that I build. And bonus, obviously, how big are the dragons in this world? Because again, it's a given that my worlds have dragons. So that's actually that is actually the first thing that I think about when it comes to, oh, let's make a new world. Okay, how big are the dragons in this one? And then I go to the power dynamics and the magic and then the characters. That all comes after the dragons. Everything comes after the dragons.
How do the dragons affect the power dynamics? That's an important one.
Yes, that is
We've
true.
actually
In
been
every
my
world,
experience.
the dragons affect everything. Yes, Isabel knows this very, very well.
We're co-writing something, so I know the
Yes.
importance of dragons for her.
Yes, that was
So
my
something-
first request.
That was her first request. I can
Yes.
attest to that.
Yes.
Characters have been mentioned a lot in your answers. So how do you tie in character and world building together? KJ?
I think, honestly, when tying them together, you've got to really understand that world and character they're not just a symbiotic relationship, they are an ecological system. They exist together. So, and one honestly can't exist without the other. So when you really keep that in mind, like how do these two elements constantly barrage each other? How do they impact each other? Are they friends? Are they enemies? Can your character walk through the forest and touch the trees? And, in Lord of the Rings, they woke the trees up. The elves did. And in other books, it's just trees are sort of background. In other stories, the trees might be carnivorous, so it could be a hunter-huntee situation. So when you really start looking at it like, okay, these things absolutely go together and they absolutely have to impact each other. And when you see that and you start to understand that relationship, then you can use them to consistently play off one another in a story, in any story, really.
This is the second time carnivorous trees has been mentioned so far.
I really want to know more.
Okay. So,
We'll ask her more after this. Erin, how do you tie in characters and world building?
Similar to KJ, my relationship between characters and worlds is a give and take relationship. I'm of mind that the world should be considered a character in itself, and it should affect, well, the world will shape what your characters believe in, how they grew up, and probably what kind of technology and magic they're used to being. It'll shape the lie and the truth that they have that turns into their character arc. And that ultimately is going to be the most important way, I think, that the world affects your character. Because after the world shapes your character has to start shaping the world and imposing their will on the world around them. And by milking the relationship between your character and the world, there can be some really juicy plot development there too.
Sil?
like I think like a character, the main character, the point of view, that is kind of the reader's lens of on the world in many ways. So that's one thing. Also, the world will determine what the character, like what belief system they have. Do they follow any religions? What religions will they follow? And how do the character behaves? And what morals does the character have? And I think also the character may change the world to a degree. I'm not in a camp that it is like mandatory for the character to change the world, but it's a possibility. So yeah.
And Maria?
Okay, so I think the most significant part of the story is the main character, first and foremost. So when the reader meets the main character, they need to be able to invest themselves and their time into what happens to this character. So I think any world building incorporated throughout the story needs to be able to build to this, to immerse them just enough to allow them to care for the character and show the kind of world the character lives in and how it is likely to affect the story. This means, for example, that details like a case system that gives the character an obstacle to overcome, or magical school, or a magical soup ladle, I don't know, that gives the character a dream to aspire to, should be hinted at the very least, and should be built to. So things that affect the way the character interacts with the plot should always definitely be flagged and explained via context. And I think this is really the way that I prefer to approach building character via world building and building the world via character development. Because when I listen to my characters, one of the most important things that I determine is this. I ask my characters, what will it take to make you happy? And I do my best to make sure the world draws out the story and the character. And like I said about the building blocks, I do my best to make sure the world separates the character from what they want. And I make meaningful the journey between where they are and where they want to be. And this is so important to me, because I think a lot of people misunderstand the purpose of world building vis-a-vis developing character, because it's not so much about the method of world building that you choose or which particular aspect you want to start with. There are people who think that the world building has to come first, because after they've crafted the world, they can throw the characters in it and sort of like run a simulation the way a computer program would. And I don't think that's how it should work. And then there are people who think that world building has to come last, or even not at all. And that if anything should be built, it should be built solely as the story needs to get the character from plot point A to plot point B, and the world just very conveniently takes them from plot point A to plot point B, and I don't think that's how it should work either. I firmly believe that world building needs to happen concomitantly with developing the story and the characters, rather than one thing first and the other thing being at its mercy. So for a story to be cohesive, then plot, character, and world have to be developed as discrete but not necessarily independent parts of a whole. And they need to be able to interact with each other in ways that are meaningful to the reader. So basically what I'm saying is trying to make it meaningful and ensuring that the world makes the character's journey more meaningful, and the character makes the existence of the world more meaningful, because that character can, what's the best way to put it? I think the best way to put it is that the way you know that you've tied character and world building together is if that character could only make the journey between where they were at the beginning and where they want to be in the world that you have built. In no other world can they have a journey that was that meaningful. And conversely, it is only with this character and this character's journey that the world means something to the reader. That is how you know that those two are tied. That is how you know that they are linked and how they have left their marks indelibly on one another.
Thank you. So a lot of world building elements have been introduced and have been mentioned, and introducing a new world can be very daunting for the first time, and at worst even info dumpy. How can this be avoided, and how much information is too much? KJ?
It's too much information if it doesn't matter to the character, if it doesn't matter to the moment, if it doesn't matter to their life and their journey. You know, a character might love silk dresses, but if they are out in the middle of the wilds and trying to survive, their constant brain power isn't going to be on this one silk dress 27 countries away, unless, you know, that's their journey, is to find the silk dress by the end of the, you know, book. So you really need to avoid all those info dumps. You just got to look at the character and the moment they're in. How are they affecting the world? How is the world affecting them? How are they reacting to these world elements? And then as the story continues, think about each chapter, each scene, each moment, and only keep the details and the setting and the clothing and everything else around there tied to that moment and tied to their emotional responses and their reactions. So.
Erin?
Avoiding info dumps can be really tricky. Generally speaking, we don't need, at the beginning of the book especially, 6 paragraphs on your magic or political system. That's definitely an info dump. But in even some of my really clean manuscripts, my editor has flagged like 2 sentences explaining this thing. It's like, no, that's not relevant. That's an info dump. And I agree with him, because it's not relevant to the immediate moment, to the characters. It's important to me, but it's not important to the characters. And like KJ said, that's what matters. If it's important to the characters, then you can reasonably expect that it's not going to be an info dump if it involves the character's journey and what's important to them in that moment. Standard practice is just to bleed information about the world through the story as it progresses. And a lot of the time, information about the world and about the story you're crafting doesn't need to be explicit. You can use subtle cues like body language to hint that 2 characters have a bad relationship. You don't need to go on a whole chapter explanation that these 2 characters hate each other and why. You can just say just a couple subtle cues and explain it through dripping throughout the book until it's actually important. And I find that dialogue is also a really good way to avoid info dumping, because when you have a character that's actually ignorant toward a concept that you want your reader to know and it's important, you can use the characters to explain that information to another character, and then by proxy your reader is also learning about that part of the world that's important to the characters and the story.
Thank you. Sil?
I think you should, at the beginning, give the information that is immediately needed for the action and what happens then to make sense, really. Like if a character has the ability to fly, I think it could be smart to mention at least the character's wings, for example, like the character flapping them or something. And so I think that is important to like describe to the reader. But I think if possible, you should like not have it in a long description of like that goes on and it's really a long list. I think it would be better to like show the stuff through action and through and if possible maybe through a character's point of view. Maybe that's not always possible, but if possible, I think that's a good way to do it. No need to like describe if the country is a democracy or a republic at the beginning. Or if it is important, that's an exception, I think.
Thank you. And Maria?
Well, considering info dumps and how much information is too much, when determining how much to tell the reader, I think the thing to establish really is trust. You need to trust your reader to remember the important and meaningful elements that you've built in the world of the story. So you also need to trust yourself to have flagged those elements and explained them and presented them in such a way that the reader would take note and the reader would know that they matter. And the best way to make sure that the reader knows they matter is not to crowd what you are telling the reader. Because if you're giving the reader that particular detail, but you're also giving them a lot of other details, then the gravitas of that one or maybe two details and how meaningful it will be to them, to the way that they're viewing the story, it's diluted so much the more that you put in. So try not to do that, because if you want them to really latch onto one part of it, and so that you know what they're latching onto, you have to be the one to determine, okay, this is what you're going to focus on because, well, this is all I'm going to give you. This is what's going to matter to the story, to the character. And you need to be able to trust that they're going to want to see more of that, because if you can't trust that way, it's going to be harder for you to reintroduce important information without it winding up mechanical or clunky, no matter when or where you do that. So when introducing and then later reintroducing this information, the thing to remember is to keep it as organic as possible so that the reader doesn't feel overmuch that they're being walked through it all again, but rather that this was important and the story conspired to tell them and later on remind them. So one, try not to crowd the reader's brain with too much. And two, if you're going to give them a lot, do it in a way that feels organic, or that will feel organic to them, because that always makes everything a little bit more easy to take. So when thinking about, telling them the intricacies of the magic system or the political system, it doesn't have to be everything, just what you want them to notice. Like, the book is not a Where's Waldo, picture book. You don't want to give them like a bunch of facts and then, hope that they jump on this one fact that was buried in that list of facts and, have them find the breadcrumb trail to where the plot is supposed to take the character. You want to give it to them in an organic way and say, here you go, this is what you need to know so that you understand what the character is going to do and why they're going to do it and what's happening around them, etc., etc. So you can trust the reader to, be smart enough to follow, but don't make them work too hard to follow. It's a little bit like you're walking a little bit ahead of them but you're not like, don't, I'm taking the metaphor too far, but like, don't get into a car and hope that they're running after you. You gotta walk ahead, but only a little bit ahead, I think. Yes, let's go with that. It's 1:20 a.m.
Let's go with that. With all the moving parts involved in world building, things can get lost and misunderstood easily. What are commonly misunderstood elements of world building? KJ?
Honestly, the understood part is I think that the worlds and characters are not separate. They're a finely interwoven rug. You know, you can't have one without the other. So when you're building, really pay attention to, you know, if you need to build your world and all the mechanics and the gears and the why questions on the side for the author, that's fantastic. You can probably use that for a dozen other stories, you know, but when your character is going through just their journey, it really, you only pull the pieces over. So pay attention to what your character is doing. Pay attention to the relationship that they have with their world. And if you really focus on that, you'll be able to easily just pull the readers in instead of overwhelming them.
Erin?
I think that the word world building itself has a lot of intimidation, especially for new writers, because it implies that as a writer you have to build a whole new world, but that's not necessarily true. You can just start small with creating the world of a little village or a city or a country, or just the life around this character and the aspects that immediately affect them, and then expand from there as your story grows. I think when you start smaller, especially when you're still new to writing, it makes it more manageable, and it's more likely that you can pull from your own experiences to fill out that world, and then research where necessary. I think when my cat again. I think the building becomes a lot easier when you start small. It's less intimidating.
So?
I think you don't necessarily need to world build the off-camera stuff. Like some off-camera can be good, but limit yourself to like the basics when it comes to the off-camera. Like I have a culture in Nirine that is way far north, and like you meet some characters from that region like indirectly a couple of times, so I need some info on it, but I might admit I've world built a lot too much on that culture, especially when at least in my main story you don't really go to that region. So yeah, but I also think that it's good to have a little bit of a catalog to take from, like how do they eat, what kind of food is it popular to eat there, a few different customs in the culture, like what do they do when the year shift from year 255 to 256. I hope that isn't in an 8-bit simulation, by the way. And yeah, like really have, like, you don't need to have too much that you can't see, so focus a little bit on where the character will go, but also have enough where the character is going. So yeah.
Thank you. And Maria?
Okay, so the first thing that I think people miss and misunderstand about world building and worlds in general is that everything is political, and I mean everything. And that doesn't mean that there should be dirty politicians in every part of the book. It just means that there are power dynamics involved in every aspect of every world, and that's why it's one of my building blocks, right? Even and especially the invisible ones. So every choice that a character makes within a world involves this. The world is built on this, and I don't think it should be neglected at all. I think there are those who would usually skip the development of culture as well as a cohesive element. So that's the second thing I think people miss or misunderstand, because there's lots of focus placed on individual aspects of the world, such as, you know, flora and fauna, and the way people look and dress and eat, and their languages, but not much on how these things all interact with each other. So I think a culture involves all of these things and more, and it doesn't hold them in a vacuum, but rather allows them to collide and mingle and affect one another. So the relationship built by every collision is what brings a particular culture to life, and that's what makes that culture seem more real. So people tend to focus on things and allow them to move in isolation, but that's not really the way culture works in the real world. Everything is connected to everything else. I think furthermore and more importantly, that the greatest strength of world building and the most frustrating flaw in its portrayal is how meaningful it can be made to the character and their journey. And this is something I've been harping on about even from the beginning, because if the world is just flavor text, then does it even matter? If the world you have built doesn't impact your character meaningfully and doesn't show the depth of the entrenchment in everything they do, and it doesn't immerse the story as much as it immerses the reader, then what is the point, right? There should be a reason this story is happening on another world and could only be told in this other world and not in ours and not in anybody else's. Otherwise, you've wasted that world building time on nothing. And the most important thing that I think, and this is the third, because all good things come in threes, and you know, I take a long time to say what I want because I say a lot of things. I think people miss and misunderstand the why of things. A lot of people get caught up in designing fantastical worlds and naming everything and adding what they want to see and deciding what will impact the story. But what gets neglected in this approach is the why of it all. Why are things the way they are here? Why are some people exiled? Why are some people respected? Why are some people just regular people? Why is there a great big divide between, you know, the monarchs and the commoners? Are the monarchs just like rich people, or are they actually state leaders? Are they just puppets? Are, you know, all these kinds of questions. So a meaningful explanation to the fantastical aspects is what immerses readers and helps them be more invested in the story and the world. So why do these things matter? Because if the world doesn't impact the characters or their plot movement and is simply there so that the writing narrowly evades White Room Syndrome or is there to provide a setting for the adventure of the characters, then that's not really a world that will matter very much to the readers, if at all, because plot points aren't the only things that need to have consequences. Why did you write this? I think purpose is such an important aspect that usually gets overlooked, because I mean, you don't need to have a grand overarching message behind the story, but obviously there needs to be something that drives you to create this world and populate it with characters and craft the story around them. So if you have that passion and if you put that love and that work into the world, rather than just saying, I guess I'll build a world, or I guess I'll write a story, you know, I guess I'll put a plot together. Obviously, if you have that kind of passion and you put actual thought into building that world and that plot and those characters, then this passion and purpose will shine through in the work and will draw the readers back again and again.
Thank you. Several have mentioned creating diverse worlds with rich cultures that inhabit these worlds. Diversity is a very important element that is also reflected in publishing. So with this in mind, how would you define the line between cultural representation and cultural appropriation? KJ?
Respect, honestly. When you're drawing out of research from another culture, don't look at it as, oh, these things are cool, I'll take those and just grab them out like they're single entities. You know, when we build our worlds, we build them with the characters in mind. So when you're researching another culture, look at that culture as a whole with the characters in mind. So, and be respectful to their version of traditions and how they work, how they think, how they operate.
Erin?
I think a lot of it comes down to recognizing that there is a line in the first place. A lot of people don't understand that you can't just take from cultures, and they don't realize the implications of their actions. And I think that although this can happen with just about any person looking in on another culture in the world, it most commonly happens with traditionally underrepresented and disadvantaged or colonized countries and cultures. And taking ideas and beliefs from places that aren't your own and warping them to suit your needs, it really is another form of colonization. And so a big part of defining the line, in my opinion, is recognizing the belief systems that you abide by and how that affects your perceptions and bias towards the cultures you want to work with. What are you assuming and what do you actually know? Do your research and, frankly, put in the effort into understanding how the different aspects of a culture work together, so you're not just dissecting the parts that you think are cool and considering all the very, very important context that makes those cool things possible. I think a best practice for avoiding going over the line into negative territory of exploitation is to avoid stereotypes of cultures and people always. Never stereotype. I personally don't like it when I tell people I'm Canadian and they reduce me to something like a hockey-playing, syrup-drinking moose rider who retires to an igloo at night. So I'm never going to reduce someone to their culture to a similar stereotype either. So if you can sum up a culture in 3 sentences, you're doing it wrong. And I guarantee you're not representing a culture. You're on the fast track to exploiting it if you're not already.
Thank you for that very, very good answer. So?
I think maybe there are like two aspects to this. One is like taking from a culture and not really giving them something back. And another thing is stereotyping and especially demonizing a culture. I might see this a little bit from a Scandinavian point of view. Our ancestors who lived 1,000 years ago have gotten a little bit of a somewhat unfortunate rap. I'm of course talking about the Vikings. Like they did, and that is fact. They did kill people. They did plunder people. That is fact. And but there was so much more. For example, they settled down places more or less peacefully. Like if that wasn't a fact, England would have been very different today, for example. And another thing is that at least on Iceland and in Norway, there were democratic, at least courts, and a lot of like semi-democratic processes as well. So it's like very complex. And I think if you're going to use another culture, especially if it's a setting, you need to research it very much. And if you're gonna take something from the culture, one, understand it, research it. Two, if possible, like camouflage very much what culture it is from, like kind of make it your own in a way. So like people looking at it will like not be able to optionally won't be able to guess where it comes from. So yeah, I think that is really my points.
And Maria?
All right. Speaking as someone who comes from a culture that at times has been represented respectfully and at other times has just been appropriated or worse, exploited, because I'm Filipino, I would say that in very simple terms, it's just respect. I would say that the difference between cultural representation and cultural exploitation is situated in the lens with which we allow the reader to view that particular culture. Because as a writer, you must never forget nor neglect the power that your words have to affect other people. And that goes in many ways. One, the culture that you are reflecting, so the culture that you have borrowed from, the culture that you are speaking of. And two, the people who are not of that culture, the people who are only just now discovering it, or who have probably heard about it, but not in the context in which you're writing. So they are, coming face to face with it, maybe for the first time, via your story or via your words. So what you write has the ability to impact both those sets of people so greatly, because if you are not careful, you might harm them. You might be liable for representing that culture in a way that either one could offend the people who belong to that culture, or convince or lead the people who don't know that culture or who aren't too familiar with that culture to believe the wrong things, or to feel that it's okay to disrespect the culture. And I think a large part of this is really maybe not forgetting and maybe not neglecting, but somewhere in that neighborhood, how powerful words can be. That's one. And how responsible we must be for the words that we use to talk about these kinds of things. Because as we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. And we must never forget that in the culture that you are speaking of, and the culture that you are writing of, there are people who belong to that culture. And that culture belongs to those people as well, in the same way. So it's not just something that you make up. It's not just something that you stumbled upon on the internet or in some book that you picked up from somewhere. These people exist, maybe on the other side of the world from you, and maybe they have very different views from you on many, many parts of life, but they do exist and they deserve to be respected. And that's another thing. I think, sorry, I have a lot of feelings on this. I think that it really depends upon the way that you show that culture, because you have to keep in mind as the writer that this culture in and of itself deserves to be respected, that this culture exists on its own as something that deserves our every respect, because it is just as valid as all the other ones that exist out there, the ones that you have heard of, that you may be very familiar with, and all the other ones that you haven't. So it's not just something that you can use to say, oh, I like this part and I want to, use it without really thinking too deeply about it because I like the sound of this name, or I like this particular thing that they do once or twice a year, or I like the way that they do their hair, and because it's just fun, because it's not just fun. It is something for them. It is something that is a meaningful part of their life. It carries so much weight for them, and maybe for you it's just fun. It's just a nice sounding name, or it's just a nice hairstyle, or it's just a nice festival, or whatever. But that's not the way it is for them. And when determining which one of those viewpoints carries more weight between you, the outsider who thinks this is hashtag aesthetic, and them who live and breathe in that actual culture, we must always err on the side of the more vulnerable. And more likely than not, the more vulnerable is the one whose culture is being used just to make pretty this particular aspect of this particular world. So it's not something that you should take or do lightly, all right? Because actually, I think the question is ever so slightly misleading, because the line between cultural representation and exploitation is not really a line. It's in fact a chasm, because there's a massive difference between the two. There is a great big disparity in the levels of respect that exist between those two, because to represent a culture means to write it respectfully and accurately and have done your research and know the weight that it carries in the hearts of the people who live it, right? And to immerse the reader in a way that doesn't fetishize or demonize or otherwise other the culture in question. But to exploit a culture means to cherry pick which aspects of it that you want to show, and to show them in a light that benefits nothing but you and your world and your story, and to bank on the sheer exoticism of that culture to be what carries people's fascination with it, rather than rely on respect and its own validity. Because to represent a culture is to say, this is another culture. How can I show it as equally valid? How can I lead anybody and everybody who reads the story into caring about this culture and respecting this culture as much as it deserves, as much as is done by the people who live in it? While to exploit a culture is to say, this is what I like about this culture. How can I use it to succeed for myself? And very clearly, there is a massive difference between those two kinds of questions. And maybe sometimes, you can't really tell, but I would posit that the line is never ever blurry. I would posit that the line is always clear. And it's only really blurry if you're not really looking at it, if you're not really thinking too hard on all of this. Because if your approach leans more towards the latter, then I think you have no place in speaking on that culture at all. So you need to be more mindful about the words you use and the things that you do.
Can I actually, am I allowed to take a follow-up question on this topic?
Go ahead, I guess.
So I just wonder, like, if you borrow a small aspect of the culture, but have it in a completely different in a completely different culture, like making a Frankenstein culture of different cultures, where it's in a completely different ecological place than the other cultures and such. For example, like having taking information in clothing tradition from somewhere, or like tying up the hair, for example, from somewhere, like just putting together, making a Frankenstein culture. Is that okay, or is that cultural exploitation?
If I may answer, just to save us time, we
Okay.
do have a panel on diversity in art. I can forward your question to them so that they can answer, since the panelists are from a wide variety of diverse cultures.
Okay.
Thank you, though. Okay, so basically respect and proper research is very, very, very important and crucial. And there's no real way to transition out of such a important and heavy topic, so I'm not going to force it. Let's wind down with some miscellaneous questions. What established fictional world would you want to live in and why? KJ?
I'm going to go with the Denis world. And if you've ever played the game Myst or Riven, or you know about the Sand Worlds and the trilogy that Random Robin Miller wrote, their worlds are just so immersive. You know, they have constructed languages, constructed number systems they've got, and the way that they handle books is, you know, when you read a book, you open it up and you immerse yourself in another world. In the Denis world, you open it up, there's a panel, and you press your hand against it, and you get to go visit that world. It's just, it's immersive, it's expansive, it goes all over the universe, but they've got these really rich, in-depth cultures, especially the Book of Denis, the last in the series, really, really gets to this beautiful, exotic land, and then rips it away, and you see this really horrible, heartbreaking underbelly that supports the world. And it's, the interplay and power dynamics are just amazing. So I'd live there in a heartbeat, all of those worlds. Just that whole system.
Erin?
So this is a really hard question for me because a lot of my favorite books aren't necessarily about happy or good places, and they tend to be really dark and gruesome and bloody because I read a lot of dystopias and dark fantasy about places where it's more about the characters overcoming the tyrants and horrible circumstances than having than more than a really exciting, friendly world that I would actually probably want to travel to. So my first instinct was the Nevernight Chronicle by J. Kristoff, because despite the terrible, violent world, I think it's a really fascinating mixture of unique culture and religion with an interesting mix of steampunk and Roman aesthetic that I would be really interested in living with. But part of me, well, I think that's probably a crazy answer because who wants to go live in a world where murder and bloody assassins are normal, right? But I can't really think of a better answer. I think I just have a really bleak outlook on the world, and where like something like that is appealing. I don't know, maybe just in another life I was meant to go to an assassin school, so who knows.
Well, from that horrifyingly dark world. So, where would you like to go?
Let's brighten it up a little bit here. I would go to, okay, you might call me very childish now because this is like from a book series made with the primary audience of toddlers. So yeah, but the world of the island of Sodor, yeah, like from the railway series written by Reverend W. Audrey, and there is there is talking trains there, and I'm studying to becoming a mechanical engineer. So it would be like really fun if vehicles could like just talk to you and say what the problems were, or give you an indication like, hello, something is wrong here. Also, like on that railway on that island, there are so little dangerous stuff happening. During like 70 years or something, there has been none like documented deaths on that railway, and that is astonishing. And every year there are like 0 to 5 incidents, and over 70 years, I think it's like maybe 2 or 3 accidents, and like in one of them, logically, someone would have died. So logically, there should have been like one accident that actually was fatal, but at least, but yet again, possibly because of the audience that didn't happen, but again, like if it was 3 deaths over 70 years, I think still it would be the world's safest railway. Maybe not so safe for the planet.
Spoken like a true mechanical engineering student. Maria?
Well, I faced the same problem as Seth, or as Aaron, because, well, a lot of my favorite stories are set in worlds that they're not places I really want to visit. It's nice to read about them, and it's nice to read about the characters surviving them, but personally, I don't think I could. So it's just nice to see them. So I had to think long and hard about this one, but probably I'd like to live in the world that Cornelia Funk wrote of in Inkheart. And it's actually a world within a world, because Inkheart is a story of this guy named Mo, or Mortimer, who, when he reads from a book, when he reads a story from a book, part of what's in the story comes out into the real world, and something in the real world, because of course, you know, when you take something has to be given back. Something in our world goes into the storybook's world. So what he read was from the world of Inkheart. So it's a little bit of an Inception type thing. There's an Inkheart in Inkheart, and that's the second one, is the world that I want to live in. So it's got the Black Prince and his bear and Dustfinger and Capricorn, and the entire world is incredibly rich and full of life, and you can see the love that the author poured into creating it. I think it's a world ripe for adventure and beautiful stories, and it really, really shows. So that entire series actually inspired a lot of the approach that I take to writing, because the power of words and the power of one's voice influenced a lot of what I write. So I think the world within Inkheart is full to the brim with the fantastical, and it scratches that escapism itch in such a lovely way. And few other worlds, if any at all, actually come close for me when I think about one that I really would love to be in.
Thank you. And finally, what are some of your favorite resources? KJ?
Well, we mentioned earlier Story Genius by Lisa Cron. So really anything by Lisa Cron, read it. But, you know, it's funny, for world building, I've actually been struggling to find really great resources. So I would recommend Jill Anderson Nelson. She wrote a book called Rivet Your Readers with Deep POV. And while it's not directly focused on world building, what it does is it really helps you to understand how to get deep into the character's psyche as you're writing and really weave the elements around it. And it helps you to, when you look at the relationship between a world and a character, using that book to sort of help define that relationship and how to immerse readers in that relationship will really be helpful.
Erin?
I'm a fan of the Autocrat World Builders workbook. It's just a short but relatively in-depth workbook where you can get started with outlining the basics of your world, from things like mapping and climates and the structures of a nation and the relationships with other nations and countries, and then of course of things like magic and technology. I'm also a big fan of the Dictionary of Imaginary Places. As you can see, I have quite a few little tabs in there. It's actually a dictionary, so there are a lot of, it's not something you read from start to finish, but like there are things like maps from imaginary places or places from mythology from around the world, including popular fictional worlds like Lord of the Rings and Earthsea. So I find it a really good source of inspiration for when I'm building my own expansive worlds, to go look at these imaginary places that already exist and find what characteristics that I want to use for my world, or have it really spurs a lot of ideas for when I'm filling out a massive expansive world of my own. And I think it could be useful for other people too.
I'm definitely going to go look that one up.
Yes.
Sil?
I have like 3 YouTube channels that okay, before I try to limit myself on time on YouTube, I looked a lot of those. The first one I'm gonna recommend is Artifaction. That one is he has described himself as a niche of a niche. Like he focuses on conlanging and astronomy, and mostly, so it's like and climates and such. So he's a resource for some of those more complex stuff. Presents it surprisingly easily, but you can rewatch his videos 5 times and always see something new. And there's then it's Worldbuilding Notes. I think that was the name. That's a YouTube channel of one who like world builds for world building's sake, so might not be too relevant for this, but that's a good source of inspiration, because Eva there, she is so creative and makes so bizarre stuff. So yeah, you may pick up some from processing how to make a builder. And then there's Hello Future Me, and he goes he is I think of those 3 the most towards writing and animation YouTuber. Like he doesn't world build solely for world building, but for telling a story. And he goes into a lot of cause and consequence, and he goes in, I think, a lot into psychology and politics, especially, and that's yeah.
And Maria?
So I might end this on a similar way to the way I started this, because interestingly enough, I prefer to go off the beaten track when it comes to world building. So I don't refer specifically to any major resources, but I do love doing research in general. So for example, for writing in general, I love anything by K.M. Weiland, who, I mean, just great. For world building, I love making maps with Incarnate, building cultures with the ethnographic questionnaire, and reading a lot of history books and political books, and doing my research regarding different aspects of flora and fauna, for example, and different cultures, and how many things interact with each other. So a lot of it is really based on what I need, because I want to be very thorough. So it's not just, this is a list of things I can do, because I've already put together, well, okay, I know this is very extra, but I already put together my own world building questionnaire for myself that I use when I'm writing my world. So it's about 50 pages of questions, which isn't really a lot when you think about how much work goes into building a world, but you know. So yeah, so I do my research, I read a lot, and then I base it on, I use tools to help me, and a lot of it is based on what I need in the moment and my own world building questionnaire.
And on the note of research and world building questionnaires, we will end our panel on world building. WriteHive has other panels scheduled this weekend, so please go to writehive.org for more information. Thank you to our panelists for taking their time to share their knowledge, and thank you for watching.